Russia is experiencing one of the toughest periods in the war on Ukrainian territory since the conflict began. The situation on the front lines is severely impacted by internal tensions and rebellion within Russia. Soldiers, commanders, and even generals in the Russian army believe that the war cannot be won until the conditions within Russia improve. Morale and motivation within the Russian army have plummeted, while the Western world is actively working to turn this situation to Ukraine's advantage and ensure its victory. From the start of the conflict, Western nations have been cautious about directly entering the war due to fears of escalating the conflict into a nuclear war. Russian President Vladimir Putin has repeatedly used nuclear threats to deter NATO from intervening directly. These threats included military exercises, nuclear modernization updates, and ambiguous statements about the conditions under which Russia might use nuclear weapons. Despite these fears, the Western response has gradually intensified. Initially, Western countries provided limited support to Ukraine, focusing on sanctions and humanitarian aid. Over time, as the conflict persisted and Russia's tactics became more aggressive, the West began supplying more sophisticated military aid to Ukraine. This aimed to avoid provoking Russia while still supporting Ukraine's defense efforts. France has taken a leading role in recent days, more so than any other Western country. President Emmanuel Macron has hinted at the possibility of sending French troops to Ukraine, signaling strategic uncertainty to the Kremlin. Macron's statements aim to show that the West is not too weary to continue supporting Ukraine. Although it is unlikely that Paris would take such a step on its own, the idea of French troops in Ukraine is being discussed intensively. Macron has reiterated the possibility of sending troops to support Ukraine against the Russian invasion. This idea has gained traction as conflicts between Ukraine and Russia intensify, especially in the eastern regions. Macron has stated that NATO and European supporters of Ukraine should consider sending troops under two conditions: if the Russians cross certain front lines and if there is a request from Ukraine. The Kremlin has warned that if NATO troops enter Ukraine, a direct confrontation between Russia and NATO would be inevitable. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov emphasized that the deployment of Western troops would lead to a significant escalation, potentially triggering a global conflict. This stance echoes President Vladimir Putin's 2021 warning that NATO's expansion in Ukraine was a red line for Russia. Experts believe that if Western troops were to enter Ukraine, it could significantly escalate the conflict. Despite these risks, Macron remains firm on his position. He has drawn parallels to France's deployment of troops to the Sahel region in Africa at the request of sovereign states, arguing that similar actions might be necessary in Ukraine to prevent Russia from winning the war. Macron's statements have naturally stirred reactions among other NATO leaders. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz and U.S. President Joe Biden have both stated that there will be no ground troops sent to Ukraine. Biden reiterated that American forces would not engage in conflict with Russia in Ukraine. Similarly, Italy's defense minister called on France not to escalate tensions with such statements. Despite the opposition from several European countries, Macron continues to keep the option of sending troops on the table. His comments have also sparked significant debate within French domestic politics. Leader of the National Rally Party criticized Macron, suggesting he was acting like a warlord and risking French lives. This domestic political tension is linked to the upcoming European Parliament elections, where far-right parties are expected to perform well. Macron's tough stance on Ukraine is seen as an attempt to boost his standing in the polls ahead of these elections. By taking a more active role in the conflict, he aims to counter the rising influence of the far right, which has close ties to Russia. This move is part of a broader strategy to maintain security in Europe by ensuring that Russia does not win in Ukraine. As the war enters its third year, Europe faces increasing pressure to adopt a new policy in response to the ongoing conflict. The West is preparing to change its strategy in Ukraine, partly because Russia is striking Ukraine more forcefully than anticipated. Russian leader Putin aims to occupy several key regions by the end of the summer, putting Ukraine in a tough position. Ukraine's military is currently stretched thin, and the delay in U.S. arms aid has been costly. The West's new strategy involves significantly increasing Ukraine's striking power. This includes moving the war into Russian territory, starting with Crimea and Belgorod. Ukraine will begin targeting Russian cities and infrastructure, including Moscow, using British long-range missiles and advanced Western drones. Throughout the conflict, Russian forces have experienced a mix of gains and setbacks. They captured key areas like Mariupol and parts of the Donbass region, but faced significant resistance and counterattacks from Ukrainian forces. In many instances, Russian advances were met with fierce Ukrainian defense, leading to a grinding attritional war with high casualties on both sides. The occupation and mismanagement of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant also raised international concerns about potential nuclear incidents. As the war dragged on, Western leaders began to reconsider their strategies. The continuous threat of nuclear escalation did not deter them from increasing their support for Ukraine. The urgency to bring the conflict to a resolution has grown, with many Western leaders now pushing for decisive actions to end the war swiftly, even if it involves higher risks. Russian President Vladimir Putin has reacted strongly to the possibility of France increasing its involvement in the Ukraine conflict, especially the idea of French troops being sent to support Ukraine. Putin sees this as a significant escalation and a direct threat to Russia. From the beginning of the war, Putin has used nuclear threats to keep NATO countries, including France, from getting too involved. He and other Russian officials have often hinted that Russia might use nuclear weapons if they feel seriously threatened. This is meant to scare Western countries into staying out of the conflict. When French President Emmanuel Macron mentioned the possibility of sending troops to Ukraine, the Kremlin quickly warned that this could lead to a direct confrontation between Russia and NATO, potentially even a nuclear conflict. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov emphasized that such a move would cross a red line for Russia. Inside Russia, Putin uses Macron's statements to strengthen his propaganda. He portrays Russia as being under attack from the West, which helps him gain support at home and justify the ongoing war. This strategy also distracts from problems within the Russian military by focusing attention on external threats. If the war extends into Russia, the conflict could take on a new dimension. So far, Russians have watched the war from a distance, but direct attacks on their territory could change that. This escalation could lead to Russia intensifying its efforts in Ukraine or even targeting European capitals. The next step in the West's strategy is to send troops directly to Ukraine based on bilateral agreements. Western countries can establish military bases in Western Ukraine without any legal obstacles, provided they are invited by Kiev. This move could involve British and French troops setting up bases, with the possibility of joining the war against Russia in a later stage. Subscribe to the channel for more updates and in-depth analysis on the Ukraine conflict, including the latest reactions from international leaders and developments on the front lines.